All right, so this is the second panel today, and we'll have a discussion a little bit on the U.S. roadmap, and I'll give just a kind of a big picture context overall, and then I'll turn it over to Mike, and then Graham will actually lead the session and moderate the panel. So this is a kind of a three-person introduction to a very good discussion. So the first thing was, I think there was discussion even this morning about the need for a plan or a roadmap or whatever we want to call it. And we clearly realized that space station had a finite life. There was only a certain amount of time the physical structure could stay on orbit, and we learned that well from the Mir program. So we knew station had, was a precious resource that we had to use in an extremely effective manner. So I asked the Human Research Program, and Mike Barrett in particular, to help us take the risks associated with human spaceflight for long-duration missions and break those down into risks, and then give me a plan to mitigate those risks that would be roughly commensurate with when space station's lifetime ended. So in other words, instead of having an open-ended research program where we're off doing really cutting-edge research, it was to focus it a little bit more from research to the application of actually trying to solve problems that when station retired, we had gained enough skills and enough risks were retired to a low enough level, we were ready to go to commit to a mission. So with that, that's kind of the beginning of the planning, and then I'll turn it over to Mike, and then we'll hear it from the panel's discussion point of view. So, Mike? All right.
Okay, thanks, Bill. That's most of what I probably needed to say. I will have to say, to start off, the Human Research Program was a very good program when I first got there. I hope I left it that good, but all I did was steer it a little bit. Just in deference to our Russian colleagues, and we talk about the concept of a roadmap, for us the roadmap is important because it gives us a clear path to deviate from. As people know, our politics come and go, but we are charged to make progress. We have this incredible asset called space station, and we want to be sure that we have a focused portfolio that gives us a strategy so that when we do all this research, we really have made progress to wherever we want to go. Dr. Scott, Graham Scott, who I hope is, there he is, good, had asked me to talk a little bit about the research roadmap through the lenses that I've seen it over the past, both from the standpoint of an astronaut, as a flight surgeon medical officer, and as the lead for the Human Research Program for a short time. I'm very glad that Bill Pulaski, who's the current lead for the program, is here. He can hold me accountable to all of this stuff. And I'll start by increasing regard to the roadmap, starting with the astronaut, who probably, I would say a lot of us in the astronaut office may not even be aware what the roadmap is, what this strategy, this portfolio of research really is. Because from the astronaut standpoint, when we look at risk of spaceflight, we look maybe a little bit more holistically. And if you ask people where's the morbidity and mortality of spaceflight, it's in launch and landing, it's in dynamic flight events. All of us have conscious memory of losing our brothers and sisters in recent dynamic flight events. So what the Human Research Roadmap does is really handle the time period between those events. That long period of time in zero gravity where there are definitely risks, there are definitely changes to the human body, but it's very, very different from what is on the radar screen of the typical astronaut who kind of understands where the risk of morbidity and mortality really is. So if you tell an astronaut, hey, you've reached your 1% administrative limit of radiation for excess cancer risk, it may not register, and that's why. That's just not how we see it that way. However, they do see it as important life sciences research. And I think that is one thing you can say to the astronaut office is really into the research. And Scott Kelly, who we're going to talk to in a little while, is a good example. I've spent a couple of nights this week working with him and with Mikhail Kornienko on some of this really high-value science, the fluid shifts experiment in particular. And they are really into this. They're very jazzed about seeing effects for the very first time and trying to understand some of our biggest risks. And that's very gratifying. But as far as stratifying these risks, what is acceptable? What is go, no go? When you're an astronaut up there or a cosmonaut and you're on a 6-month mission or now a 12-month mission and you're doing an experiment to try to decide whether 6 months or 12 months is safe, it doesn't register as a big picture of a research portfolio. From the former flight surgeon perspective, so the flight surgeon definitely looks at risk even more holistically than the crew member, because each crew member has their individual experience, their flight experiences, and each of those experiences is tied to several anecdotes. And I think all of you probably know that anecdotes are fairly rampant in the field of space medicine. And anecdotes are free and worth every penny. But when you put a bunch of them together, you get a database. And that's what the flight surgeon is looking for. So both that and the operational monitoring that's done, and the big payoff from the Human Research Roadmap is the peer-reviewed research that comes out of it. Because then you have a physiologic basis that you're going to practice medicine on. And that's what we kind of wait for in the flight medicine world. The other thing is transition to ops, because when we develop countermeasures in the research world, and we'd like to have a seamless transition to an operational countermeasure, whether it be exercise or medical monitoring. That's the other big payoff for the flight surgeon, and the roadmap has definitely given us that, and definitely will continue to give us that. Now, speaking from the research manager, I told Bill I wouldn't use the word bureaucrat, but from the research manager standpoint. So the roadmap obviously gives really big dividends on many levels, because obviously the stated information is relevant to our exploration scenario. And in some ways, it can't matter which of the big destinations we're going for, whether it's Moon, Mars, asteroid. That's not our decision, but our responsibility is to make progress. And so that whichever of those destinations we decide to go to, we're as ready as possible. And basically, one thing I learned early is that we had a moniker that this research would help us to fly as safely as possible. There are those who say you shouldn't use the word safe when you're talking about human spaceflight. In fact, the Institute of Medicine made that point very clearly just this last year when we asked them to look at the ethics of human spaceflight. You may not fly safely, but you're going to fly informed. And that's the big issue with the Human Research Roadmap. We want to find out as much as we can, again, peer-reviewed data that is solid, that we can bank on, that we can share with others as stepping stones. So I think with that, those are kind of the three things that we look at. I would also say that the roadmap lends itself to international collaboration because it is a solid framework. It's a place where we can agree, and we actually have made some inroads on that, certainly in discussing with our Russian and international colleagues an international version of that roadmap. So it gives you a basis for progress. So with that, we have a great panel actually who can kind of core drill on the roadmap and what its possible contribution can be. And I will turn it over now to Dr. Graham Scott. Dr. Scott, I think, is well known to a lot of you as a history in military aviation, academics, business, research. Just the perfect guy, has a very refreshingly pragmatic approach to this whole business. So I will turn it over to Dr. Scott.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier and Dr. Barrett. And I wanted to start by really saying how much I enjoyed the previous session that Dr. Ushakov chaired. I mean, it really elevated the discussion. We didn't get down in the weeds. It was a very strategic discussion. And so, as you'll hear from my introductory comments that will be brief, I would like to recommend to this esteemed group of folks that we have somewhat of a strategic discussion about the US roadmap as well and not get too granular. Good morning, everybody. And we've heard some quotes already from President John F. Kennedy, a very famous leader, of course, has a tight connection to space exploration already during the summit from other presenters. And let me offer one more quote that I think may be germane to the discussion we're about to have. So on the 28th of June, 1963, actually President Kennedy addressed the Irish Parliament. Some of you may know this, and he made the following statement. Other people see things and say why, but I dream of things that never were and say why not. So we here in this room as scientists, engineers, physicians, cosmonauts, astronauts, and leaders are all, of course, in the business of asking why. Why do we have a US roadmap? Why are we spending a valuable hour and a half of this important summit talking about the details of the US roadmap? Why does the US roadmap matter? Why should anyone outside of this conference room or anyone outside of the United States care about the US roadmap? May I also suggest that we're also all in the business of why not? Why not become a two-planet species? Why not explore the solar system? Why not undertake this deep space exploration in our lifetimes? Why not learn to live and work in space for years on end? So, as we discuss in the next hour or so the technical and nitty-gritty details of the US roadmap, that is the what and the how of the US roadmap, can I also please ask of the panelists and also that of each of you in the audience, please to not forget these central and frankly maybe more aspirational and more important questions of the why and the why not in regards to the US roadmap. So those are my introductory comments, and with those as a backdrop, what I think I'll do to make this somewhat expeditious is briefly introduce each of the panelists. So our first panelist is going to be Dr. Serena Ornon. She's an astronaut, former flight surgeon, and frankly an inspirational speaker. Next to her is Dr. John B. Charles, the Associate Manager for International Science within NASA's Human Research Program, and previously the Human Research Program's Chief Scientist. Next to Dr. Charles is Dr. Rick Lenihan, astronaut, veteran of 4 space flights, STS-78, STS-90, STS-109, STS-123, and veterinarian. Dr. Peter Norsk, element scientist for the Human Health Countermeasures, or HHC element, which is one of the largest components within the Human Research Program. Dr. Bill Pawlowski, the manager of NASA's Human Research Program and a professor at the University of Houston. And Dr. Julie Robinson, chief scientist for the International Space Station, at least on the US side. And then, last but not least, Dr. Terry Taddeo, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at Johnson Space Center and the lead flight surgeon. So with those comments, we have until Mr. Abbey informs me, until about roughly 12:25 or thereabouts for the panel. So I think if you can keep your comments, your prepared comments, to 10 minutes or maybe slightly less than that, we should have adequate time to move through all of the speakers and to have a little bit of time left over for questions. Dr. Ornon.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Scott, and everybody for the excellent introductions. Again, I'm Serena Ornon. I'm one of the members of the 2009 astronaut class, and as a former flight surgeon, as an astronaut, I'm going to give you a little bit of a different perspective, maybe more of an operational perspective, because when you talk about the U.S. human roadmap, you obviously think about major risks to human exploration. And when I give talks, and I give a lot of talks to high school students and even junior high school students, I ask them, the first question is, what do you think are the biggest barriers going to Mars or even someplace further? And sure enough, 90% of the time, number one answer is radiation. The second answer is, well, what are you going to do if something breaks along the way? And so surprisingly, I'm always very happy with their answers because those are what I see as some of our 2 biggest roadblocks. And I'll spend a very limited amount of time on radiation at the end because I know we do have a panel. But as an astronaut here on the ground supporting missions right now, something I see every day are things breaking on ISS. You know, it's a lot of the engineering that was developed a long time ago, and it was as good as it could have been for the ISS, but it's engineering that needs to continue to be developed to be robust enough to last a trip to Mars. So when the toilet breaks once a week or every 2 weeks, or our system to remove CO2 breaks down even more frequently, these are concerns. When this happens, what you see on the ground is a whole team of people with well-run procedures, ground testing of those procedures, people staying up long hours to make sure that the system gets back to a nominal operating status. And on a trip to Mars, that may not be an option, certainly with the time delay, and certainly by the time we get very, very close to the planetary surface, you may not even be able to contact the ground for any useful amount of help. So how do we develop a system, multiple engineering systems, that can be autonomously repaired by a crew? This is what a crew member thinks of. Hey, if this breaks, can I fix this by myself? Am I going to need all this help? And if you tell me it's so robust it won't break, I will not believe you. Everything breaks on orbit. So from a crew member's perspective, that's one of our biggest priorities. Looking more from a former flight surgeon's perspective, and our Russian colleagues hit on this earlier, we think about, hey, do you need a doc for an exploration class mission? Should we send someone highly trained in the medical field? If we do or don't, what about the sort of training that takes place during a long mission? How do we handle things like medication expiration, consumable usage? You ask even tougher questions. If you have one crew member that gets sick, very sick, 75% of the way towards Mars, Do you use up all the consumables in that one crew member? So these are tough questions we often haven't had to ask because we have such frequent cargo deliveries to and from station. We've got everything that we need up there and lots of it and reserved to spare. On the way to Mars, we may not have that. And so we may have to make those operational decisions ahead of time. And finally, I will touch on radiation just a little bit, only because it's something near and dear to every astronaut's heart, because we do have our levels that are measured and given to us yearly by our flight medicine clinic and tell us if we're suitable to fly for a 6-month or a 1-year mission. I think we need an accurate model to be able to predict space radiation. So the radiation we get on ISS is a very low dose rate. We obviously have the Earth's magnetic field. We have the atmosphere protecting us. But do we really do a good job of accurately modeling that? I think we need something better in order to help translate that into clinical outcomes, because only then are we able to predict the effects, the health effects, both short-term and long-term to the astronaut. Thank you.
Dr. Charles.
I am, as Graham said, the Associate Manager for International Science, and part of my job in that role is to understand what tasks need to be done using resources of the International Space Station and how those tasks can be divvied among the resources available from all the partners on the International Space Station. But my connection to the thing called the roadmap goes back at least 15 years. And that is, I feel as if I was present at the creation of the roadmap, at least on the U.S. side. In terms of the definition of the term roadmap, we had no qualms about adopting that as a nomenclature for the document that we were compiling. In fact, at that time, in the early 2000s, under the management of the Johnson Space Center Space Life Sciences Directorate, we were so bold as to call it the Critical Path Roadmap, to make sure everybody understood how important it was. And we eventually put Bioastronautics Critical Path Roadmap in case people thought it was a critical path roadmap for building a better mousetrap or something. But I would like to say at that time that it was neither a critical path nor a roadmap. It was a collection of the risks that we thought we had identified in preparation for sending astronauts off to the moon and on to Mars. At that time, the goal was to send astronauts to the moon for intermediate work, and lessons learned on the moon then be applied to trips to Mars. So the risks that we were defining at that time, which populated the roadmap, were based on what we perceived to be the worst case, or more politically correctly, the most challenging mission scenario, which would be the Mars surface mission. And our assumption was that any activities that could be prepared for and any risks that might be resolved in preparation for the Mars surface mission would therefore count toward risk resolution for lesser missions like moon missions and asteroid missions and low Earth orbit missions and so forth. That was our guiding philosophy. Populating the roadmap, and that is establishing the set of risks, seemed to me to be a fairly straightforward task. We would do exactly what Dr. Gushin was recommending, and that is ask the scientists what needed to be done to go from here to Mars at some time TBD in the future, 2025 or so. This was done by not myself alone, but with a triumvirate of people. Dr. Lauren Leviton, also of NASA's Johnson Space Center, and Dr. Frank Saltzman as the cat herder, the organizer from NASA headquarters, and I formed the triumvirate that would establish that set of risks. And we did ask all of the NASA scientists for their most considered concerns, their most considered set of risks. And after much deliberation, came up with a set of 65 risks to human spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit. With some consolidation, some wordsmithing, some juggling and jiggling, we decided we could get the list down to 55, and I immediately claimed success and about a 10% reduction in the risk going to Mars through strictly bureaucratic methods. The list has been maintained and further refined, and I hope Dr. Pulaski is able to tell you about the current state of the risk list. I think the number, I've lost track, but I think it's now about 35 risks that we consider important to humans going beyond Earth orbit. But part of the problem is, as Dr. Gushin identified before, asking the scientists to identify the path or the roadmap to a goal. In our case, the goal was Moon and then Mars. But that's all we were told. We were not told anything more than the basics of the mission duration, and I sort of insist that people still refer to the 6-month transit, the 18-month time on Mars, and the 6-month trip back, even though the numbers vary depending on launch windows. But even more granular than that, pardon me, Graham, for getting granular, we didn't know how many people were going to be going to Mars, how large the vehicle was going to be, how long the ladder was going to be from the crew compartment down to the surface. Would they be doing a surface EVA immediately after landing, or perhaps following a more considered approach of getting their Mars legs before they actually try to go on a surface EVA? None of those things, which makes it very difficult to ask your scientists, your specialists in the research topics, how to prepare astronauts to go on these missions if you can't give them any more than less than the basics of the mission. So we have tried over the years, and I note that because the missions are not yet defined, it's not realistic to define the missions that well this far in the future, but we are still assuming certain characteristics of Mars missions, and that still plays into our discussions with the scientists about the risks that need to be resolved today. But with some guidance and some prodding, we did come up with, as I say, this the set of 55 risks, which then was handed over to implementation and management to allow the scientists to start working on it. I think the process has been fairly successful in the meantime, getting us to a useful set of risks and a more directed program. So this is simply a way to frame the subsequent discussion. I hope the rest of the panel and I can join in here and let you know that the risks that we're going to be talking about and the roadmap that these risks will be allowing us to follow is not something that's done arbitrary. It was done with some consideration, some deliberation, and with the best information available to us at the time in those dark, benighted days 15 years ago, early in many of our careers. And we have now got a well-established set of risks, I think, and we're well on the pathway to resolving those risks and allowing people to go off to destinations beyond the Earth orbit.
Thanks, Dr. Charles. Dr. Linehan?
Excuse me. My background is as a veterinarian, a life scientist, and a comparative pathologist. That was what my training was in. So I want to shrink it down a little bit and build kind of on what Serena said about the roadmap. Things from my 4 space flights, although they were short space flights, they were shuttle space flights, and my background in life sciences, I've seen that things do break. And in the greater scheme, it's going to be very important to have strong ecosystems, EPS systems, and a solid craft. But in the life sciences side of the house, it's going to be just as important that we are able to sustain crew members and get them to where they need to go. And I don't think, where we are now is where we'll need to be when we get to Mars, back to the moon, wherever we go. We need to kind of take it up a notch, a tier in terms of where we've been maybe for the last 35, 40 years with life sciences. And what I see is the main thing on the human side of the house is maybe a triad, which encompasses immunocompetence, musculoskeletal fitness, and we go back to what Serena said, radiation. I know that kind of ties in, dovetails with immunocompetence. It's for a discussion later. But all that factors in terms of how, and I don't want to step on Terry's toes here in terms of medicine or anything like that, but how we practice and take care of our crew. Right now, and there's experts in the area right now on Mars missions and exercise. I think it's extremely important that we figure out new methods of resistive exercise to keep people healthy. We talked about what happens when someone isn't healthy and they get there a year later, something breaks. Well, it may not be eclipse, it may be someone's leg, it may be someone's arm, something of that nature. How do we fix it? How do we keep people healthy? Maybe one of the areas that I think I won't say necessarily have ignored, but haven't looked at hard enough is immunocompetence. We know, or we think we know what happens in short duration and even long duration, and we know what happens with long duration exposure to radiation, types of radiation. But what are we doing about it? And one of my bailiwicks is that I'm really interested in is I did a little bit of work with DARPA a long time ago on radiation, and I've worked in lab animal, is how do we keep people immunocompetent? So how do we get them from point A to point B, wherever point B may be, and we'll say it's Mars, and over that time period keep them immunocompetent? Maybe we don't. Right now, with what we've got in terms of technology, we have shielding, and we know the shielding's not going to work. But why aren't we thinking about ways to immunologically shield these people in terms of radiation vaccines? And it can be done. We can vaccinate against radiation damage. We can't stop the radiation, but we can stop the end products and the cascades that happen to people when they're damaged by radiation. And that focuses in on immunocompetence. Probably at some point we need to be looking at long-duration crew members getting stem cell therapy, or looking at some way of isolating the stem cells beforehand, protecting them, and infusing them with their own cells when they get to point B, if we can't keep them healthy, or if we can't protect them the way we probably are going to need to. So part of what I've been interested in and working at HRP with Dr. Pawlowski is I've mainly been interested in the exercise aspects, the immunocompetence aspects, and the nutrition in terms of how nutrition ties into both of those. Some type of engineered nutrition program is also going to be necessary. And so my main impetus and interest are in those areas, and I know that's shrunk down quite a bit from what John just explained, but that's what I hope to continue in and make some contributions in as we go through in this pathway.
So, Dr. Lennon, can you say a quick word about the stem cell initiative? If I can, maybe that's a little too strong, the word initiative, but some of the thoughts that are going on in regards to stem cells?
Yeah, I don't know if I call it an initiative yet. I'd like it to be an initiative, but we've spoken with people, University of Pittsburgh, the medical center here, and different specialists in the areas about getting them involved and bringing them on to look at research programs, which, and as a tangential, this is why CASIS and the rodent research is going to be so important in terms of what we're doing over the next, 5, 6, 7, 8 years on station, and then beyond what we learn, because we're going to use those animal models and probably ground-based animal and human models to determine what we'll use as therapies. And so right now we're trying to pull together a group, and we have a loosely knit group right now where we're interested and want to come in and start looking at this problem and possibility of, omics therapy for individuals, stem cell therapy, banking stem cells, and then reinfusing cells, maybe on long-duration missions, something to look at over and above where we are right now in I won't say flight medicine, but the medical aspects of how we treat crew members when they go into space and come back.
So this could be the crew members banking their own cells, for example?
That's a possibility, yeah. And one of the possibilities. It could be simply as early on as just stem cell injections for as people do now. Astronauts get old, astronauts wear out, so maybe we want to inject their joints. Maybe we want to bank their cells, and we know, or we think we know what's going to happen on long duration flights in terms of how they're going to be in terms of their marrow and their immunocompetence. So why can't we take the cells on the ground, bank them or protect them, and maybe, if they're on station, come back, reinfuse them. But if they're going someplace where we can't infuse them when they come back, they take them with them and reinfuse themselves when they're there.
It's great to see 21st century medicine potentially being applied to the roadmap. So, Dr. Norsk, your prepared comments?
Yes, thank you very much. My background is, as indicated by Graham Scott, that I'm the element scientist of the human health countermeasure element, which is the physiological part of the human research program. It's extremely exciting to be there. I came 4.5 years ago with a background being an MD and doing research actually through the European Space Agency on the space station, on the shuttle and Mir. So I had some experience with how to implement science into the space scenario. However, the exercise, and I think I've been successful partly also because you have a very efficient manager guiding me the right way. So because I was actually more fundamental scientist. And one reason I went to NASA was that my son asked me once, I asked my son, what do you want to do? Well, I want to be a medical doctor. But Dad, I want to do something useful. And in this particular context, it made me think a little bit. And that's why it's excellently done at NASA with the roadmap, because it gives science an applied purpose, a specific purpose for one of the great endeavors of mankind, getting into deep space. That is what is so exciting working at NASA, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I find it extremely fascinating. Now, The first question, can we go to Mars physiologically and protect people? And the answer is probably yes. We could, probably with the current countermeasures. The question is, how safe would it be? How well would the astronauts perform? And would there be any long-term detrimental effects on health? So it's the effect of the consequences of what we do. We probably could do it. And we probably could do exercise or whatever. But as indicated by Serena, things break down, and so what? So we need as much science, as much knowledge into the program in order to, 1, protect the astronauts most efficiently, 2, have the most efficient countermeasures, and also optimizing their performance and maintaining their health after flight. And how do we then, as John indicated, get the right scientists to respond and to answer our questions? That is where I have a big challenge. So on the one side, you have scientists like I used to be, totally wild, doing all kind of crazy stuff that may not have applied purposes, but they have a lot of knowledge, getting into an efficiently managed program and getting the right knowledge into that program and prioritizing it correctly. And that is a challenge that is difficult, but it can be done. And that's why we need the roadmap. And that's why I would push back a little bit on some of the Russian inputs that, at least in the United States, we need a purposeful roadmap in order to guide the scientists into the right venue and then have an efficient and prioritized program. So I fully, as a scientist, support this, and I work within those boundaries. But of course, we still have discussions between the more fundamental scientists, myself, management, and top management at NASA as to what should be done and what is the right thing to do. But I think the outcome will be the most efficient way of doing things. Now, another thing which is extremely challenging for deep space missions, we only had about 26 people beyond the Van Allen belts, only 26 people in the Apollo program. So we have very little knowledge as to the synergistic effects of radiation plus weightlessness plus isolation plus unknown factors. And what has been really surprising to me as an integrated cardiovascular physiologist who didn't know anything about, very little about the cellular mechanisms before I came to NASA, that is that these synergistic effects, these effects of each of these environmental spaceflight factors actually have unexpected effects at the cellular level up to the integrated level. So we need to have that knowledge, to capture the right knowledge to understand how to protect the astronauts at that level. And that's why we sometimes need to expand our research portfolio a little bit beyond the roadmap per se. And I think actually under the guidance of Dr. Pelosky, we have been allowed to do that. There has been some fundamental implementations into the program, which I think is correct, but we have to find the limit. I mean, there's a limitation as far as you can go. And finally, I would also say, and I would like to commend NASA for looking into alternatives in terms of protecting health. Artificial gravity is something we are looking into as an alternative, as a tool for a later decision-making process. But I think it's very visionary from the side of the program as well as from NASA that we can look into these issues, because I guarantee you, not only as a scientist, but through my whole life, we will find something surprising. Something will be discovered while we do research that we didn't anticipate, like the vision impairment is a cranial pressure problem. And I guarantee you we will have to put resources in places we didn't think about now or do not think about now. We will have to do that in the future in order to protect the astronauts efficiently.
So, Dr. Norsk, you mentioned that you used to do wild, crazy research, I assume in Denmark. So how aware were you of the roadmap when you were doing this research? And the corollary to this question is, how effectively is the roadmap communicated to our community of researchers?
Yeah, I did not know anything about the roadmap.
Really?
Yeah. I learned the first thing when I started at NASA was that I found out, I had to find out how the organization worked, and I'm still working on that a little bit, but I'm getting better. But the other thing is that, no, I didn't know about a roadmap because from the European side, to be honest, it's a more fundamental program. And from the European side of the European Space Agency, but people may correct me from ESA if that policy has changed, it's more fundamental looking into the basic physiological fundamental effects of weightlessness and spaceflight environment on cells and living organisms. So it's a little bit of a different purpose from the European side. From NASA's side, it's exploration, and therefore it's much more applied and directed, and it's that's why we have a roadmap here at NASA. I didn't know about the roadmap, but I know about it now, and I have learned a lot about management. And you know what I learned? I learned that it's extremely important that we don't only have scientists managing the program. I know, Bill, you are a scientist, but you're also a manager. And I think it's extremely important because if only scientists manage the program, we will get nowhere. If only managers with no scientific background manage the program, we would have no science. It's a combination that's challenging, and it's a combination that makes it fascinating.
Do you have any, from your perspective, do you have any thoughts about communicating the roadmap? Are we doing a good job of communicating the roadmap?
You know, Graham, I have an opinion about everything, even though I don't know anything about
That's
it.
why I'm asking.
And I have to be careful because my mother warned me about that when I was young. I do have an opinion about everything. I also have an opinion how do we communicate it efficiently? Yes, I think we do actually. I think the important thing, I don't know how well we do it to the public because that's not, I'm not so much into that. I have the feeling that, but Dr. Belowski can talk to that later, he's the manager of the program, but I think the communication from the program into the top management at NASA seems to me the roadmap and the risk description is an efficient and right way of communicating to top management, also because you have to consider when you, from a scientific point, a scientific program communicates with managers, engineers, and people with different backgrounds and different cultures, you need to know how to communicate it correctly so that those people receive the right information in the shortest possible time. I mean, if you have billions of dollars and you have 1,000 boxes and HRP, human research program, is one or two of them, you have to have an efficient way of communicating what you have obtained. And that's why I think that the roadmap, as well as the risk reduction, path to risk reduction, is an efficient communicating tool, and I think that's why we're doing it.
And you sort of, my last question for you before we move to Dr. Plosky is you touched on this a little bit. So when you talk back with your colleagues back in Denmark or back in Europe, you mentioned you didn't really know much about the roadmap when you worked over there. So how do those discussions go? How do you have those discussions? And you said you thought the roadmap is excellent. So I guess you're out there proselytizing and telling them this roadmap is excellent and that they should really take a look at it.
Yes, I'm only at the element level, so I'm not a policymaker or anything. I have to be careful not overstepping my authority. But I would say that when I talk to people in the European Space Agency or other international partners, I do think we should prioritize between the agencies on a worldwide basis in order to make all of the programs as efficient as possible. I think we should exploit also agencies, scientists outside the United States, maybe a little better than we do now. I know we are working on it, and we are doing it, I think we are doing a good job, actually, much better than we did a couple of years ago. But I still think that distribution of resources between the agencies, as well as scientists who are not happen to be US scientists, should be done maybe a little more efficiently. And what I try, jokingly, so don't be offended, but what I try to tell Americans sometimes is that 96% of the world population are not American, so there is knowledge outside the United States. But I also tell people in Europe that actually United States is actually the country that invests most money into the space program, and whatever NASA decides, I am pretty sure that the other agencies would like to follow up and support that. But I think we should give each other a chance to do that in a collaborative fashion. Maybe communicating that a little better would be good.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Norse. Dr. Plosky.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Roadmaps are anathema to scientists. They don't like schedules. They don't like plans. They want to just think. Roadmaps are critically important, especially in the NASA world, to be able to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and to convince your bosses and their bosses in the Congress that it's worth investing in doing these things. So, it's not surprising that a lot of our scientists are unaware of the roadmap. Most of the ones that are intramural scientists or close to the program or close to operations are very familiar with the roadmap. But we communicate the roadmap to the folks that we fund through the solicitations we put out for proposals to come in and do work on things that we think are important. And that's really a critical thought process. We need to to keep the scientists thinking about science and understanding what we think is important and contributing new ideas to what we think is important, while we are keeping track of how we're doing against the roadmap and burning down the right risks so that we can get to the destinations that we want to go to at the times that we want to get there. So, this morning when I first came in, I sat at a table and someone across the table said, "Oh, there's Bill. He's the guy with all the answers." And I looked back and I said, "No, I'm the guy with all the questions. At least I think all the questions, because questions keep coming up. The more we fly, the more experiences we have, the more we have new questions." About 4 or 5 years ago, when we had started getting a good deal of experience with flights of 180 days or so, we started realizing that crew members were having some visual impairment that we hadn't seen before. We never would have thought about that as a question to go follow up on, but it started happening over and over again. And so someone came to the program, and I wasn't here yet, I've been back for 2 years doing this, and started saying, "Hey, what is this and what's causing it? And somebody ought to go look at that, because is this going to be an impediment to us going for longer time in space or to new destinations?" So, a major portion of what I asked Peter and the other element scientists do with the other element managers, and the whole cadre of our scientists, who at any one time, we have about 200 grants that we support from people all around the United States. We also work closely with the Russians, the Europeans, the Canadians, the Japanese, and others. DLR Institute is a good partner, for instance. So we have a lot of international collaborators. We're looking for inputs from all those places. When new questions come up, these questions are frequently coming from the operational community. They're coming from space medicine. They're coming from the astronaut corps, from Dr. Linehan, Dr. Aunan, Dr. Barrett, and saying, "Hey, we're starting to see this, and maybe we need to worry about it." In the last few months, there's been a lot of discussion about whether we have the right CO2 levels aboard the space station, because we're starting to see a higher and higher incidence. Even though we keep putting in chits and asking the station programs to run their CO2 scrubbers for longer and longer, we're starting to see evidence of more symptoms of headaches and the potential for cognitive dysfunctions that come along with this at levels that we would not have predicted from what we know on the ground. It turns out the military is seeing the same thing, OSHA is seeing the same thing, and CO2 requirements in factories are starting to be reduced. But we're starting to look at this. So one of the main parts of my job is to constantly be on the lookout for new questions. I have to believe that Peter and the element scientists and the element managers are going to structure the solicitations correctly and bring in the brightest people to answer the questions, and we'll answer them in the time frame that we need. We do have, and people have seen it, this nice swim lane chart that has 23 risks on it, John, that some of them are red today, some of them are yellow today, some of them not. We're not working on any that are green today, but they're things that could be impediments to future missions that we need to work down on. We have some idea of what questions we need to answer and approximately the time frame that we can answer those questions in. But it's science, and I have to keep on reminding. I just did this a couple days ago with Mr. Gerstenmaier when I did my quarterly review. I showed the swim lane chart, and I reminded him that we have some milestones out there where we think things will change from red to yellow or yellow to green. But it's a research project, it's a research program, and the error bars around those milestones are really big. So roadmap becomes a good communication tool up and out to the rest of the world, but the down and in really depends on what that roadmap prescribes for the next period of time that we're working toward. So the other main aspect of the human research program is to try and find the right populations and the right venues to answer these questions. And if it can be done in a laboratory, that's the simplest for us. We just write a grant to that university and the people do it in their laboratory. But many of the kinds of questions we have to answer require access to ISS space station for simulation, or to chambers like the NEK chamber at IBMP or the new NVHAB facility at DLR, or maybe Antarctic winter rover stations or other places where we can put people in environments and simulate the space flight environment for longer periods of time, so that we can get answers that approximate what we might expect under the circumstances of the kinds of missions that we're talking about that we can't simulate right now. So we're constantly looking for and developing relationships with people who are owners for it. You know, we don't have enough money to go and build our own facilities for all these things, so we try to share them with other people and get our scientists access to those facilities so they can answer the questions in meaningful ways. The space station is probably the best simulator we have of deep space missions, but it comes up short in a few areas. You've heard some of those before. Isolation and confinement on long-duration missions is going to be really challenging, especially when communication one way could be as long as 20 or 30 minutes. We have to have autonomous crew operations. In station, they're constantly tethered to mission control. Crew members have their own cell phone. They can talk to their family. They can do all this stuff. So we can't simulate that kind of isolation very well. Radiation environment is higher in low Earth orbit than it is on the Earth's surface, but outside the Van Allen belts and away from the mass of the Earth, the galactic cosmic rays are going to be a whole different game. Right now we simulate galactic cosmic rays using a facility at Brookhaven National Laboratory where we can create beams of galactic cosmic rays, and we're just at the point now where we can create beams that have mixed fields that can really simulate the kinds of radiation that crew members will be exposed to during those missions. We use rodents and tissues and other small creatures to examine the questions that might be of interest to humans, and then we try to extrapolate from there because it wouldn't be ethical at this point to be putting humans in front of those beams. But you know, there are questions that come up, and there are new findings that come up that make us worry that, you know, maybe we don't know everything, and then we have to ask, you know, is it because it's in this species and we don't know how to extrapolate it, or is it something we really have to look at? So, you know, our group is constantly looking at what the new questions are and trying to assess whether we need to invest in it. The way we've resolved to invest in these is through a joint board that we have at Johnson Space Center. It's a medical board. It's run by the medical community. Jeff Davis chairs it. Research is there. Usually operations folks, the space medicine folks are there, and often representatives from the crew office are there. And we periodically, every year, we go through all the risks we have, and we assess the severity of the risk for different kinds of mission scenarios that we're considering, from longer duration station missions out to a year at a time, to missions that would be in cislunar space for up to a year at a time, to missions that would go to an asteroid, or to missions that would go in the vicinity of Mars, and whether it's to the Mars surface or an orbital mission to Mars, or one that might land on Phobos or Deimos and have crew members there for periods of time. We look at how the risks, that the set of hazards that we understand stack up on those missions, and then we compare all the evidence we have for that risk at the current time for the kinds of consequences that might come from that risk, whether they're consequences that would occur in the mission to either crew health or performance, or consequences that might not appear until well after the mission. For instance, the development of cancers 20 years after a mission because of radiation exposure. So we have this team of people that meets once a week. We often meet for an hour or two. We look at whatever the risk is of the day, and we look at the latest evidence we have from all sources, balance that against these things, and then update periodically. Now, most of the new data that we need comes in some cases from operational observations, but usually it's coming from the research program. So researchers are bringing the data in. So we have this process of assessing the severity of risk, and whenever a new question comes up, we start looking right away at that board. We start getting all the people who are smart to get in the same room and start thinking about, you know, what might the consequences be on these kinds of missions? Are they significant enough that it would warrant new investment? And so should that be added to the list of risks? Should HRP go off and start investing in some research projects in that area so that we can then answer those questions in the timeliest fashion that's possible? So I could probably go on for a lot longer, but I'll stop there and let Julie talk.
Well, I have a couple of quick follow-ups if I could, Dr. Pawlowski. So you mentioned the international partners, particularly in the context of analogs. So when you sit down with the international partners and you discuss different projects, and presumably the roadmap probably feeds into that, what's the response? What's the level of familiarity with the roadmap, and what's the response to the U.S. roadmap?
I would say again that the roadmap is more of a communication tool. Often when we're doing the one-on-one negotiations or the multilateral negotiations, we're talking about the questions that we think we need to answer. So the roadmap for my program helps to drive what are the most important questions, what are the most urgent questions for us to work on. Now, John, through the Multilateral Human Panel for Research, is working with all the International Space Station partners to look at roadmaps that might be an international roadmap that are contributed by all the partners and what they think. So John might be able to give you a little bit more insight into how the international partners are thinking about that kind of a roadmap. But again, I see it as predominantly a communication tool and one that helps manage this large program to try to figure out where to put our resources.
Okay, one more quick question, because you mentioned the role of the Human Systems Risk Board, and actually this came up in the Russian session as well. Dr. Gushin mentioned, what might be, and there's probably not going to be a one shoe size fits all, but what might be a reasonable cadence for the roadmap to update. So have you had any thoughts or discussions along those lines? I mean, obviously, if it's updating all the time, it's confusing, but if it's too static, it's also not maybe useful. So
yeah,
what are your thoughts?
There are a lot of time scales to think about. What we do from a programmatic standpoint is try to get each risk through the risk board once per year, so that we have a 12-month update on the new information that's come around. From a larger programmatic standpoint, we think about budget cycles, which also tie into once a year in the U.S. But then we think about congressional cycles, because when Congress changes, then there can be a different perspective, which is every 2 years. And then we think about presidential changes. When the administration changes, they might have a whole different take on the direction that we're going to be going in. And so that happens either on 4 or 8 year centers, depending on whether the administration is renewed or not. Some of those things are a little bit above the level of our program. They have more to do with the overall strategy of what we're doing in low Earth orbit, what we might do in a proving ground in the vicinity of the moon, and what we might do as Earth-independent missions come forward in the future, ones that go all the way to Mars or go to asteroids or something like that. So there are different time frames, but I think the basic time frame is once per year for each of the risks to come through, and then as needed when new risks appear, when somebody has some new concerns. For instance, the CO2 concern that's come up recently it's going to get a lot of airtime over the next period of time as we start thinking about it and getting all the people engaged in trying to understand what we need to do to understand it better. So that'll be more rapid until we get a good plan for it.
Great, very helpful. Thanks, Dr. Pawlowski. Dr. Robinson.
Well, I was going to make a few remarks from the context of the world that I live in. I've spent the last decade of my career in an engineering organization, the space station program, mostly trying to explain to the engineers that manage it what the scientists are thinking. And then every now and then I go talk to the scientists and trying to explain what the engineers are thinking as well. And if you look back at human spaceflight, there's always been a tension between the engineering systems, which are designed, and the human system, which is a mess from an engineer's point of view. So here's some of the problems with the human system from an engineer's point of view, as I've observed them tell me. The first is that it's fragile. It breaks easily, and you can't improve the materials. So you're stuck with the poor quality materials that evolved here on Earth. The second is that we didn't design it, so we actually don't know how it works. And that's a particular problem for troubleshooting, because when something goes wrong, we may have 3 or 4 flight medicine opinions about why it went wrong, and all of them may have some basis in observations and analogs. And in fact, medicine even today remains partly art because the human system is so complicated and we don't know how it works. So a good doctor is part artist making good judgments without information, and part scientist making good judgments with information. The third problem with the human system is you can't reboot it and start fresh when something goes wrong. So in a complex system, mechanical system, a lot of times if you just turn it off and back on and get the avionics to restart, problems will go away. And there is no equivalent of that for humans that we've become comfortable working with anyway. And yeah, maybe sleep, Bill says in my ear. The fourth problem with the human system is something we've only learned about in about the last 10 years. And so that's really within the lifespan of the ISS. And that problem, an engineer would say, is that the human system is not built to print. Build to print to an engineer, right, is you have a design and you hand that design to somebody and they make it off that design. And then every copy you have works the same way. So if you can figure out what's wrong with one copy, you know what's wrong with other copies. Well, what we're learning now that the human genome has been completed and is this whole realm of personalized medicine has opened up. And as we get good understandings of the mechanics of how things are actually working from the genetic level all the way through the whole physiology of the organism, what we're finding is a lot of different systems have about 10% exception. So there's enough genetic variability out there in humans that when we understand how something works for 10% of people, it actually doesn't work. So a drug works for most people, but for 10% of people, maybe it doesn't work effectively. And you can find that yourself. There are 10% of the people in this room that if they taste the Splenda that's out there at the tea and coffee station, will find it doesn't taste good because they have a different genotype than the other people in this room. So that variability in humans is why we've been so successful as a species. But from an engineer's perspective, it makes it even worse because that means if you know, even if you think you know what the system does, the particular human that you care about at a particular point in time may not actually follow the pattern completely. So I think that the big change that I talked about there in the diversity of the human system also provides great opportunity because what it's done is it's accelerated the rate at which we are understanding how physiology works from gene all the way through to the whole organism. And as we're tackling those problems back here on Earth, that information then helps us to better understand the problems that we're seeing on humans in orbit. It also means that we don't actually have to fly an average human because in time we may understand better that there's a certain set of humans that are going to be much more successful at handling the radiation or much more responsive to treatments that we encounter or that we develop for radiation, for example. And I'm going to set the ethical issues aside of that just to say that in all exploration endeavors that humankind has had so far, I would argue that every human being was not equally suited for those endeavors as well. In the past, everybody got to go, and the ones that were suitable were the ones that lived. That's how it worked on Magellan's expedition, for example. 127 went and 13 returned. And one of them was not Magellan because he was not, his leadership skills at least were not suitable for that mission. But that's not the way we want to do it in our modern world. So now we suddenly have the chance of using science to make better choices, both about the way that we treat some of the medical issues that arise and in the way that we select astronauts. So what does that have to do with the roadmap? Well, I think, first of all, since I've learned today that roadmap is a very challenging word to use in an international context, I've already been thinking about what are some better words. And the fact is, the best word for it is really a checklist. What we're working on today is NASA's checklist of things we ought to do while we have the International Space Station. And there is a checklist in the Russian program as well. And we've made it into a nice Gantt chart, which makes Bill Gerstenmaier happy because he's much more comfortable with us when we have a Gantt chart instead of a checklist, and I don't blame him for that. We call it a roadmap because to an American ear, it sounds more important that way. And we don't want to call it a scientific strategy because then the scientists will run amok and figure out that everything fits into that strategy. So that's always the problem that we have. So I think that the challenge that we have now is that we have so much information we could collect, and we have a pretty good American checklist, I'll call it. There's a good Russian checklist out there, but we also have what we've inherited in terms of the art of medicine from our previous space history. So on the International Space Station today, we have two different ways of treating the crew, basically two different ways of tending the human system so that we think it will stay healthy. Different exercise regimes, different food regimes, different approaches to things. And those come from our diversity of experience and from the art of flight medicine back from the days of Laika and Troika when we didn't know we didn't know anything. We thought, one of the early risks for human spaceflight was that people would choke on the contents of their stomach because it wouldn't stay down, because it would float up. And that's pretty logical. Fortunately, that doesn't happen, or our spaceflight time would have been rather short. So as we progress, we have a better and better checklist. But that checklist does include art and assumptions and medical practice, things that aren't written down and things that aren't fully understood, things that just worked, that were art, and crew members came home fine, and so we just stick with them. So even though this is supposedly a panel to talk about the NASA system, since I spent a lot of my time trying to bridge between different scientific communities so that the experiments we do in orbit can be as efficient as possible, I just wanted to kind of conclude my remarks by saying we have to use this time on the ISS to get a consolidated checklist and agree that we've got the right list. And that list will not be the same as the list that Bill's working for today, because there are probably some things there that have been stumbled upon by other spacefaring nations just by chance that we need to think about. I don't think the list will be the same as the list anybody's working for today, but that list will help us have a single exercise system, a single food system, a single rehabilitation system perhaps on a new planet. All of those things have to become consolidated because we don't have the mass and we don't have the space to have anything but a very streamlined support system for this fragile human body. And so as I look out, I'm very enthusiastic to see things like field test, which is a truly joint U.S.-Russian investigation going on at landing that really gets us toward a common protocol for what do we do with crews when they land, and what can crews do when they land on the surface of a new planetary body. Fluid shifts, which happened on orbit today, a truly joint investigation. I think it was a good one because none of us had good medical history on it, so none of us had biases about what we should do, and so it made sense to just go do the basic investigation. And there are a number of other problems and things that we also have great opportunity to work together on. But I think our charge is to use the next decade on the International Space Station to both consolidate our checklist and check as many things off as possible so that we have a merged science of the human in space and we know how to manage that body in a way that we don't even yet today. So thanks.
Those are really good comments, particularly your comments about probably no one has the perfect checklist, which speaks to this group of this international group. So, Dr. Taddeo, you're the anchorman, so over to you.
Indeed. So, and I'll keep my comments brief. I realize we have a hard stop coming up here, and I think there ought to be some time for some Q&A. The function within the organization that I'm a part of that's relevant to this is that my team owns the development of standards for astronaut selection and for medical certification for flight. We also provide the in-flight medical support and psychological support to crew members on missions. And we then own the responsibility for health care of those individuals during their NASA career, and then to perform occupational monitoring, if you will, post-career, that then informs us if there were any risks to human health later on in life from individuals flying in space. So that's why, well, I guess I'll answer the question, why is the roadmap then relevant to that function? And identification of potential risks, and then the performance of good science and the development of good evidence based on that science really lends to some informed decision-making when it comes to creating standards, to developing countermeasures for these long missions, and then in developing our monitoring strategies both in flight and post-flight. That's really the strategy in a nutshell. Just to go into a few details, we continue on a regular basis to review what our standards are. We work with our international partners actually to come up with as uniform a set of standards as we can. Again, to ensure that, number one, the crew members, their risk to long-term health from space flight is low, and also to ensure that the risks to mission outcome are low as well. Like in other words, you don't want to have a mission terminate because there was some unforeseen medical event that perhaps we should have foreseen. So as we go forward looking at future missions going to the moon or going to Mars, it's paramount that we have a good idea of what the risks are so that we can provide our requirements to the relevant programs to say, here's what we need to fly. Here's what you're going to need to fly in terms of hardware, in terms of monitoring capability, in terms of being able to provide whatever the crew needs to perform autonomously in terms of providing their own care, to do the mission safely. And if in fact we can't have all of those things because of mass, because of volume, because of cost, or whatever, then at least the program and the crew members are making an informed decision about what the program ought to be and whether or not they actually want to participate in that. And that would really involve the nation as well. You know, as far as the taxpayers go, are they going to buy off on, well, here's the level of risk that we see going forward to going to Mars or wherever. So I think that's really it. Again, to sum up, the critical path or the roadmap is important because it helps us make those decisions and provide those requirements to the program to provide for crew health and safety and enhance their performance as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Taddeo. So we have 10 minutes. Why don't we open it up to the floor for questions? I'm sure there's a lot of questions for our panelists. Dr. Dinges has a question I see already. So if we can have some microphones, and so up on the corner, and just kind of let me know, and Dr. Gushin has a question. So maybe we'll start with Dr. Gushin, seeing as how the microphone's here. I'll come to you, Dr. Dinges, okay?
Thank you to the panelists. I'm especially satisfied with what women were speaking about. First, a very quick opinion that it's really not the roadmap, but checklist with risks and problems and answers to the questions. Because a roadmap means that you are moving somewhere. We are not moving. It's relatively detected movement. Now the questions about the wolf in the for this little red cap. I think the wolf that was mentioned in the first talk is very important. What do you think about that risk of machine? Of course, people are very fragile. It's always better not to send them, but just imagine that we reached another planet and something is broken. What is the risk that the crew will not be ready to repair, taking into consideration lack of instrumental resources and probably time resources? I think we underestimate this risk. What do you think?
So just let me disagree with your first comment. I think we are going someplace. We're building the rockets now that are going to get us beyond low Earth orbit. We don't have specific plans, but we have general plans for what we're going to do with those rockets. We have vehicles that we're putting in development that will bring us at least in the cislunar space, and we're looking at what the vehicles are going to be required to get us to the Mars space. So we are moving, and part of the reason that my program gets funded is to answer these questions. So by the time the rockets are ready, we have the answers for the second part of your question, which is what are the risks for cislunar space, for instance? What are the red risks, and have we burned those down? Do we have the right mitigation plan so that Terry's group can monitor and protect the crew members properly during a mission? So I think we are going someplace. We expect to be going someplace. Mr. Gerstenmaier might want to say more about how soon we're going to get there and how firm we are. But I think we're investing an awful lot of the U.S. taxpayers' dollars into rockets and vehicles that are going to take us someplace outside of low Earth orbit. So.
That's not the answer to the question. I'm sorry. What's the answer? What do you think about the risk, not of the problems with the cognitive functions, of the not of the musculoskeletal system, but the problem is the skills on another planet under not weightlessness but microgravity when the system is broken?
Mm-hmm. We don't have the answer to that today. We have a plan to get the answers to that in the time before we need it.
And a very quick second question. What about the roadmap of the engineers? How much the roadmap of the medical people is coinciding with the technical roadmap?
I would say that it's fairly closely coinciding, at least from the human research program and the medical operations folks. We're tightly coupled with the rocket scientists that are designing and developing these systems that are going forward. I'm on Mr. Gerstenmaier's staff, and the people that are building these systems are on the staff, and when we have strategic planning, we're in the same rooms together, so we understand each other and we're talking with each other so that we're communicating back and forth between the engineers developing the systems and the human users, at least the people that are developing the technologies and the mitigation schemes that they're going to have to incorporate in those vehicles. So there is communication there.
Glad to hear this.
Okay.
For us, it's a problem.
Thanks, Dr. Gush. I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in. Dr. Dinges.
Just quickly, thanks to the panel. This is really sort of for, I think, Bill and Julie, you may want to chime in. The question is, how effectively have we been able to take the data in any of the areas of concern medically from the 6-month missions and analogs, et cetera, and run mathematical models and statistical projections on failure rate, and run the models for then an acute exposure or a broken leg, and look at the failure rate for the mission. In other words, are we doing that? Are we using mathematics to predict exactly what we think is going to happen? And do we keep loading those models with more realistic data of things that really happened, so we get a good understanding of what is likely to happen?
Yeah, that's actually one of the functions of this human system risk board. So when people come forward with the data, and some of the data are research data, some of them are operational data, when they come forward, when we have sufficient data, we'll do a probabilistic risk assessment. So we're looking at the consequence that could occur, and then we're looking at the likelihood of that consequence occurring in as quantitative fashion as we can. As you know, in many cases we have a paucity of data, so there's not enough modeling that we can do. But where we can do modeling, we do, and we inform the risk update each year with new data that gets introduced from that year. Yeah.
So the risk update can be informed by that. I think that would be a useful exercise. I mean, you're doing it, so I just encourage you to keep doing it, because I think that is really the way to go forward.
Yeah, and so, we're at the infancy of some parts of it, but we're moving along at a pretty good pace to be able to incorporate this on a regular basis.
I would just add quickly that there has been some modeling done to actually looking at the incidence of particular medical conditions on previous flights, and then looking at the incidence in certain populations to forecast just as a decision-making tool. It's not what we rely on. We rely on expert opinion. But to say these may be the most likely events that you're going to see in a 6-month or a 1-year mission. So.
The interactions are tricky.
Indeed.
Okay. Dr. Longnecker, please.
My question is for Bill and John. In the course of your presentations, it looked like we went somehow from mid-60s. We have about a third of the areas or risk categories now that we had when John started. How much of that reflects actual countermeasure development that retired that risk versus how, in which case, if it's a lot of those, we ought to have a huge celebration, and how much does it reflect, if you will, lumping rather than splitting as you look into things? I mean, ultimately, you're down to one risk, which is human health and performance, if you lump enough.
We try to avoid that. So if you were to come to our investigator workshop, which we hold in January every year, there would be 600 investigators there. Typically, you would probably find about 800 risks that would be talked about. The risk that John talked about that we all worked on 15 years ago, this list of 65, were informed predominantly by the scientific community. The way we've gotten it down to about 30 risks and about 23 that probably require research is through this human system risk board, where we're actually systematically looking at it from a medical side, research side, operational side, and we're beginning to introduce, as David suggested, probabilistic risk assessment. Some of these have been mitigated because we thought they might be risks, and our observation over a long period of time is that we have them under control, and we don't really think they are. Some of the risks, for instance, bone muscle cardiovascular function, have been mitigated in large part by countermeasures that have been developed and tested on the station that show that at least for 6-month periods, we can protect bone, muscle, and aerobic function within reasonable limits for people to be able to continue performing when they get to a planetary surface without assistance there. So, we still debate some of these things. So some of these are yellow and not green. We're not really good to go without any more intervention. What would, the exercise devices we use today are about the size of my car. They weigh more. They break down more often. We're not going to send that to Mars. So what's the new version of the system that will provide the same protection in a smaller package? But I think from a practical standpoint, we have a working countermeasure that can mitigate those. So the likelihood of bad consequences is reduced to the point where we're not as concerned about that anymore. So we are making progress. The progress goes somewhat slowly, but the first 2 years of this board, where we really worked hard to try and get through all the risks and make sure we understood all the data, got us from about 40 or 50 risks down to about the 30 or so that we have now, and I think that's going to be stable for a while now.
So John, a very quick comment from you if you would like, and then we're going to close it out. Did you have anything to add to Bill's comments?
Well, I never turned down a chance to talk. A lot of the reduction in the number is just a better understanding of the situation. Those things that we considered risky, we may not consider risky anymore. There is a degree of lumping involved, and there is, through the efforts of the Human Research Program and others, actual solution to some of the problems. So it's a combination of those efforts.
Okay, I want to quickly, in 30 seconds, summarize some of the main points. The US roadmap is actually very robust and has gone through a number of iterations, as we've heard in this last part of the discussion we've just been having. However, questions continue to arise. It is dynamic, it is updated, and there is another robust process for looking very carefully at each of the risks, and that's the Human Systems Risk Board that we discussed. The roadmap is somewhat destination dependent, and some of the astronauts in particular raised this very major risk of radiation, and then also the issue of autonomy plays into how you think about risks. And the other point that I heard as a theme was that there's a need in the longer term to have a roadmap that incorporates input from international partners, that looks at when we're using international analogs, how all of that is kind of assimilated and concatenated together. So with that, I'd like to conclude this session. I'd like to thank the panelists, and could we have a round of applause for the panelists, please?